Hey everyone, I'm Joe Brady and I'm going to be your host today as we explore one of my favorite subjects, landscape photography. Today we're going to explore some tips and tools to let you get the best digital capture so that you can bring out all of the beauty and nuances in your images. So let's get right into it. I'm going to talk a little bit about landscape photography in general and how the gear that we're going to explore today can help that. Now, landscape photography, it should be relaxing, right? Well, I don't know who said this, but landscape photography really can be compared to big game hunting. You prepare, you sit waiting for your prey to arrive. In our case, the sun gets close to rising, the light quickly appears, and you're in a rush to capture its fleeting perfection. And before you know it, it's gone. Now, sometimes you'll find a scene seemingly appear out of nowhere. You might be driving along. You're both inspired and in a frenzy. On several occasions, I've quickly pulled the car off the road, yelled out, "Photographic emergency." I usually say that to my wife, grabbed my gear, and jumped out of the car. Fortunately, being married to a photographer, she understands and even encourages this. Now, in this kind of situation, will I always meet her? I'll admit that sometimes the answer is no, not always. I have found, however, that using a meter and learning how to see the light has really helped me evaluate with my own eyes. And I've also learned how to adjust my exposures accordingly. I can't take full advantage of the tonal range of the camera because I'm afraid of clipping those highlights. That's where I'll use a meter. So when I'm not in a big rush, and particularly when I encounter a scene with a very high contrast range, I will always use my meter so that I can take full advantage of the tonal range that my camera has to offer so that I can get the best image file possible. So why do I find this important? Well, I realize that the lighting and the atmospheric conditions I'm experiencing may be unique. Maybe I'll never see them again. Many times I also understand that I may never be back to this spot again. So I want the images that I capture to be the best possible. The way a photograph freezes time allows me to revisit these places and explore that moment in time that's really never going to happen again. And that's one of the unique things of still photography. Now, after the rush and inspiration and energy, I always take time to stop and soak in the place that inspired me to photograph it. For those of us who are fortunate to visit beautiful places, I find it equally important to reflect on what caused me to want to photograph that scene in the first place. And that's going to help with my composition. Now, if you share my passion for the landscape, you understand the joy you can experience when you capture a scene that talks to you. It actually has a visceral effect on you, and that you'd like to share that with others. So we're here today to talk about getting the best possible digital file from such scenes so that you can share the beauty of that place with others. This should be easy, right? Unfortunately, it often requires a bit of work to make it happen, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we've got some challenges, and what are they? Well, there's a couple of big limitations your camera has compared to your eyes. First of all, tonal range. Now, your eyes work differently. They're more like a video camera than a still camera. They've got constant adjustments of the iris, the chemical changes and how your eyes process light, and your brain processes a continuous series of snapshots. So the absolute dynamic range that your eyes have in a scene is going to be 20 stops or more. The best digital SLRs capture maybe 8 or so stops, with most coming in closer to about 6.5. So what else is going on? A couple more limitations. First of all, color temperature. Your camera can only have one color temperature setting at a time, again, while your eyes adjust constantly depending on where you focus. For example, you take a photograph and you've got your color temperature set for daylight sky. However, then the areas in deep shadow, maybe in front of you, are going to appear extra blue. Also, contrast variations in the same scene. Your camera has a single contrast curve, while your eye again adjusts depending on where you're looking. Now, all this might help explain one of Ansel Adams' famous quotes about landscape photography. He said, "Landscape photography is the supreme test of the photographer and often the supreme disappointment." Our goal today is to help you get your equipment out of the way so that you can pass that supreme test. This can also help you focus on the real reasons you're taking the photograph in the first place, and we'll talk about that a little more later. What we need to understand with our digital camera is that the best digital capture may also not look that good on our camera's LCD or even when we first open it in software. What we need to do is capture the best data so that with a little bit of nudging, we can shape that image file into a photograph that reflects the impression of the place that we saw with our own eyes. And for me, again, having a meter will go a long way towards making that happen. Now, if you're not familiar with it, I'd like to introduce you to the Sekonic 758. What makes this a somewhat unique piece amongst other meters is that it contains both a spot meter and an incident meter. Now, we're going to focus today on using its spot metering capabilities, its ability to learn how our camera sees light, and the calculation functions that are built into the meter that will quickly and easily give you the information that you need so that you can capture the best file possible. So here's how I'm going to proceed. First, I'm going to show you how to calibrate the meter to your camera. We're going to do this with a combination of Sekonic's DTS software and an X-Rite ColorChecker passport with the Sekonic gray cards. Here's the X-Rite passport, and this is a little special edition one. It's got a Sekonic gray card in it. We'll tell you more about how to get one of these later if you don't already have one. Then I'm going to show you how to make a few changes with the meter's custom functions that will really kind of customize it for landscape photography. Now, after we've got the meter calibrated and set up, we're going to take some of the images I captured and transform them into an image that shows the true beauty that was captured in that file. Now, this part sounds like it might be a little complicated. It actually isn't. You're going to be amazed at how fast and easy it is to do, provided you captured the best data possible from the beginning. Now, I recently spent a day at a location that was both a beautiful and a challenging spot for photography. The place is called Raymond's Kill Falls. It's part of the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. It's about 2.5 miles south of Milford, Pennsylvania. Now, the challenge that I faced was it was a bright, sunny day, but I had waterfalls with bright falling water reflecting that light, puffy white clouds, but I was standing in a forest with deep shadows. The tonal range and the contrast was pretty extreme. In fact, when I first got there, I wasn't sure if a single shot could handle it. I thought this was going to be HDR territory. So I needed to make sure that my captures were taking advantage of the camera's complete tonal range while ensuring that I didn't clip any highlights. I needed to have detail in both the flowing white water of the falls and in the clouds. So my job was to put those highlights as possible, as far right as possible in my exposure without losing any of that data. Now, to make that happen, I took advantage of the spot metering and calculation capabilities of the Sekonic 758. So let's go first through the process of creating an exposure profile for the camera. This process, in essence, teaches the meter the camera's complete tonal capabilities. So we're going to start by shooting the ColorChecker at the location. So let's take our first trip out to Raymond's Kill Falls. Now, to help my meter work its absolute best, I'm going to do a calibration for it, and I'm going to do that using the ColorChecker passport here. And it's really a very simple process. I need to take a couple of readings that I'm going to then put into the software, the DTS software, to load the camera calibration into the meter. What this does is it ends up teaching the meter how the camera sees light. Because remember, every camera is a little bit different as to what it considers light. And again, as you can probably see, you can see here on the video, because I have the iris on auto, it's a beautiful, breezy day, nice puffy white clouds, but the sun is coming in and out of the clouds. So I'm getting dappled light, I'm getting not dappled light. So I have to be very careful that my metering is consistent when I do this. So I'm going to be shooting at 100 ISO because I want to be able to, if possible, blur those falls a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take an ambient reading that is hitting the target here. So I'll just come over here and get that, and it says 1/15 of a second at f8 at 100 ISO. Wonderful. So I had to move my target to do my calibration because the little post that I had the target sitting on all of a sudden found itself in dappled sunlight. And that's going to completely screw up your reading. So I really want full shade. Now again, I do want to make sure that there's no specular dots hitting the dome. Occasionally I'm getting a little bit of that. So I'm just going to move my hand so I just see it start to cast a light shadow over the dome. And let's see how much of a difference. Basically 1/10 of a stop difference just with me casting that little bit of shade. So in this case, it's not really hitting the dome. But if you were out in a spot where it was sunny and you were trying to do this, definitely make sure that when you're doing your metering, just put your hand in between the sun and the dome, and that'll give you the best reading. If the sun's actually hitting the dome, what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up underexposed because the light actually hitting the dome is going to skew the reading. Now I'm going to switch my meter to spot metering, and I'm going to take a reading here. If you haven't done this before, is the number that you're going to get from the spot meter reading off of this is going to be different than your ambient reading. And don't be surprised, it could be 3/4 of a stop or so, but that's to be expected, and the software calibration is going to put those all back together. Now, there's two different ways that you can get your exposures for this target. You can either vary the aperture or the shutter speed. Now, I'm going to do it at aperture first, but shutter speed is very handy if you have a lens that doesn't open up wide enough. Now, this is a lens that is a 2.8 lens, so what I want to do is get my first shot at f8, and I get f8 at a 1/15 of a second. So that's going to be my first shot. Now I'm at f8. I'm then going to take two more shots. One 3 stops open, which is going to be f2.8, and one 3 stops closed, which will be f22. So let's go ahead and do the 3 shots. And just make sure this is square to my camera and not in any dappled sunlight. So there's my f8 shot. Let's do the 2.8, which is going to be 3 stops overexposed. And then the other way, f11 is 1 stop, f16 is 2 stops, f22 is 3 stops. So now I've got 3 exposures. Now, if you have a lens that doesn't go to 2.8, what do? Well, you can do shutter speed instead. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go back to my f8. So remember, my settings here were f8 at a 1/15 of a second, and again 100 ISO. So I'll go ahead and take that shot again just so I have another sequence. And now I'm going to do it with shutter speed. So again, remember, I'm at a 1/15 of a second. I need to open up 3 stops and close down 3 stops from that point. All right, welcome back. A couple questions now, and here's one I want to address first. Someone said, I said a camera captures 6 to 8 stops. Someone said, how does this contrast with the 16 stops, 16 EVs of a D800 Nikon? And my experience has been that those numbers in practicality are pretty bogus. I shoot the Sony Alpha 99, which was tested by a place called DxO, you may have heard of them, as having the greatest tonal range of any DSLR out there right now. And when I ran it through the DTS software, I found out I was getting about 8.5 stops. So I don't know where these manufacturers are coming up with these 12 and 14 stop numbers. When I test it in reality, I find it nowhere near there. So it's a good question. I should look into that some more. And all right, let's get this out of the way right now. A bunch of people were asking me, where'd I get the shirt? So if you ever happen to be in Milford, Pennsylvania, go take a trip to Raymondskill Falls. There is a shop there called Life Behind Bars. It's not for prisoners, it actually means handlebars. That's where it's from. So check them out, they have a website as well. And also, everybody wanted to know about my iPad case. It's a MoCo case, M-O-K-O. You can Google it and you can find it. You can get it on iPads or Androids or Kindles. I have it for my Kindle as well. Back to the important questions though. How close is using the ColorChecker Passport to using the Sekonic Exposure Profile Target 2? You may be aware that there are a couple of other targets that you can use to create custom exposure profiles. Now, yes, those targets are still available, and they might even do a little bit more precise job than the ColorChecker Passport because they've got more gray patches. However, the advantage that the ColorChecker Passport offers is that it can also be used to create custom camera profiles. It's not just kind of a one-trick pony. As wonderful as those exposure targets are, their sole purpose is for creating the custom exposure profiles for the meter. The nice thing about a Passport is, well, one, they're tiny, they're less expensive, and they have a lot of other functions. I've got, for color profiles, I've got a white balance, I have my gray card, and I have some other stuff. This is a whole subject in itself. So what we'll do is we'll send you a link to a program that describes the whole custom color profile process in detail. But I did want to point out that the dual functionality and lower cost of the Passport does make it a nice alternative. All right, a couple more questions. Somebody asked if I can comment on the tonal range of digital versus film. Again, that's going to come up to negative film versus slide film. Now, I admit I haven't shot film in some years now, but I used to work for a film company, so I'm aware of it. Slide film generally is around 6 stops. That was kind of the experience that I had with the best slide films. Negative film, you have more, and it depends on the light levels. About a negative film is you can overexpose a negative, and the negative just gets denser. You don't lose data, it's still kind of there. So, depends on the ISO, maybe you'll get 8 or 10 stops of tonal range with a negative film, but slide film is very close to how digital works. Somebody asked about an iPad color card app. I have to admit, I don't know what it is. I haven't looked into that. I will look into that and take a look at the follow-up when we send it to you. If you want to send me a note, I'd be happy to discuss it. Somebody asked about, can you use your camera spot meter to get a usable reading? Good question. Now, your camera spot meter is generally about a 5 degree. There's a couple of advantages here. First of all, this is a 1 degree spot meter. And that 5 degree spot that you have on your camera is also going to change depending on what lens you have on it. If you have a wide angle lens, well, the 5 degree is going to become much larger. If you have a longer lens, a 200 millimeter or longer, then you are going to get a pretty decent reading. Yes, you can get a good reading that way. It's generally not going to be quite as precise, however. So just give yourself a little bit more of a fudge factor, and we'll talk about what that number is in a little bit. A nice thing about this meter, again, is it actually has 2 separate sensors in it. That's why when we run through the DTS software, which you'll see in a second, we actually calibrate both of these sensors. That's why you take a reading, that both incident and spot, so that they then get back in sync. You also have the advantage of when you do a spot meter reading in here, it gets recorded into the meter, and there's a lot of functionality you can get out of that, including an instant adjustment for both exposure, and if you're using a filter like a circular polarizer, it can compensate for that for you immediately, and that's what we're going to see. But that said, if you're just going to use a spot meter on your camera, yes, you can use it, and we'll talk about that a little later on how to work that way. Let's see. Somebody asked, should I set a different ISO for profiling? My experience has been that if you're in kind of the middle range ISOs, if you're 100 to 400, maybe even up to 800 ISO, there's not a huge difference in the tonality of the sensor. When you get up higher, then it does start to change. So if you do find yourself shooting very high ISOs frequently, you might want to create another profile. I did for mine. I have a profile for 1600 ISO, and I have a profile for 100 ISO, because you're going to lose tonal range as you go up in that high ISO shooting. Let's see. Okay. So somebody asked, is calibration scene specific, or once you calibrate, are these settings work going forward? It's not scene specific. The calibration is going to be more, like we just said, it's going to be more ISO specific. As long as you're at 100 ISO, then your camera has that tonality, that tonal range to be able to capture. Somebody asked, how well do your meters work at 30 below zero? I have no idea, and I hope I never find out. But actually, there's some tech guys in the chat room. We can see if they can answer that for you. Let's see. Lastly, before we continue, someone asked, what do I do calibration-wise if I shoot with multiple cameras? Good question. When you create an exposure profile, you can create as many as you want. The software will take as many as hard disk space you've got. In the meter itself, you can store 3 separate profiles. So hopefully you're not shooting with more than 3 cameras at the same time. And I have 3 profiles loaded into here. I have one for my Alpha 99. I have one for my NEX6, which is my mirrorless camera. And actually my 3rd profile that I have in here is my Alpha 99 at the 1600 ISO. Something I don't use that often, but it's there because I had the spot for it. Last question. Someone asked, what do you do if you already have a passport, but not the one with the Sekonic gray card? Good question. I was going to get to that, but let's answer it right now. There's a couple of options. First of all, with the spot meter capability of the 758, you can use the 4th gray patch in on the target to take your reading. It is tight enough through the viewfinder that you can get just that. If you find that a little squirrely and you'd like something a little bigger to work with, then you can get yourself one of these. This is an X-Rite mini gray balance card. They're about $40. You can do it. We'll send you the link for this as well. You can carry this around. It's got its own little case that it comes with, and this will give you a bigger gray area. Also, if you happen to still have one of these things around, this is the original full-size ColorChecker, then here's your patch again. Technically, it's very slightly different than the target inside the passport. Technically, this is actually a 20% gray. These are closer to 18%, but the 2% really doesn't make a difference when you're doing your calibration. It's less than 1/10 of a stop difference, so you can go with that. So those are your options. When we are done today, though, there will be a special offer for you, either if you don't have one of these and you'd like to get one, or you are interested in getting a 758 because you don't have one, and you can get one. Well, you'll see. You'll see with the special. I'm not going to give it away yet. We're going to have to wait for that. So let's continue on. So we've captured the target. You've seen the two different ways of doing it. One, adjust your aperture. So we did 2.8, f8, and f22. Again, if you have a camera that doesn't do that, maybe you have a lens that's a variable of 3.5 to 5.6 or something like that, that doesn't have that range, then you just do it with shutter speed. It's really that simple. So we've got the images captured for the target, our 3 exposures. Now let's go into the DTS software, and I'll show you how quick it is that you can actually create the profile, and then we can get it loaded into the meter. Take a look. Let's take a quick look at creating and adjusting a custom camera profile for the Sekonic meter. So I'm going to click on Create New Profile right down here, and we're just going to use Quick Mode. Now obviously we shot our targets using the X-Rite ColorChecker, so we're going to select that, click on Next, and when we did our incident and reflected reading, we can check our shutter speeds, and I was at 1/15 of a second at f8, 100 ISO, and it was the same for both reflected and for incident. And then I can click on Next. Now I need to tell it where are the 3 targets that I shot. Alright, so I had a handful of images in this folder, but here I can see my 3 target shots, the perfectly exposed, 3 stops open, 3 stops closed. Then I can click on Next, and I will click on the first image, and it will give me little pointers to let me know to apply those alignment marks. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll just click on one, drag it to the corner just where the target starts, and do the same for the other 3. It just allows it to find the target. Then I can click on the other 2 images, and since we were on a tripod, everything's lined up. And it can pick up from the metadata the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture that we used for each of the images. Click on Next, and it will calculate out the curve. Now these curves are very conservative, just to let you know, and we can see down here that it's telling me my clipping points and the actual dynamic range. So I can see this red line is the dynamic range, and I can see it goes down 3.9 stops from the middle, and it goes up 3.5 stops. Now the clipping points are very conservative. You can see it's showing me plus 2.8 and minus 2.7. That's how I came up with the 2.5 number to put my highlight right along that clipping area. So then I can just save that, give it a name, and I'll just call it DTS. I'll just call it DTS Webinar for the 758. Click on OK, and it saves it. Now, if you want to just get a little bit more out of your camera, you want to put it a little closer to the edge, you can edit those profiles. So let me click on Edit, and I'm going to change the exposure range. So I just go get the profile we just created. Here it is, DTS Webinar 758. And here's our curve. Now, if you look right here, it has levels for the dynamic range and for the clipping point. And it's saying that 245, meaning our 0 to 255 range, is going to be its absolute. You can leave this there, or you can make it a little bit closer. I'm going to go a little closer to the edge and make it 250. Remember, 255 would be pure white. And because of that, I'm going to now make the clipping point, instead of 230, I'm going to make that 245. And that gives me more tonal range on the highlights. Mid-tone 118, yes, that is correct. And then same thing on the downside. And I can see that it's going to 20, where 0 would be pure black. I'm actually going to leave that one alone. I am going to bring my clipping point down a little bit more. I'm going to make that, let's make that 25. So what that just did was it extended my range. So it's really telling me my safe areas now are plus 3.5 stops and minus 3.2 stops. This is an optional step. You may or may not want to do this. When you click on back, you can then just save it. I'll just overwrite it. And then I can download that profile into the meter just by clicking on the profiles I want and sending it over. Let's go take a look at that graph again. Look at the one that I actually did for my shoot. So I take a look at this graph and I can see my safety range, and I had set for plus 3 and minus 3.4 on my complete tonal range. The reason I chose 2.5 stops open on the meter when I was trying to find that brightest white is it gave me a little bit of wiggle room. If maybe I wasn't metering in the brightest spot, maybe there was something else in the view that was brighter and I didn't see it. By going to 2.5 stops, that will put it very close to the edge, but give me a safety margin that I don't have to worry about clipping. I want to get close, but I don't want to actually clip. Okay, a couple quick questions. First of all, someone asked, what is the advantage of using a color checker as opposed to a gray card? Now, if you're talking about the color profiles, again, it's a subject for another day. But in short, having a gray card is going to give you a correct white balance. However, every camera has a different idea as to what red, green, and blue are. You might have noticed if you have two different cameras that the color response is different. Some cameras have a different idea of what red is. By having all of these color patches here, the software knows what the values of all these colors are, and it allows it to create a camera profile so that all the colors snap into place. So you do a white balance in combination with the profile. So that's the advantage of it. And if you're not familiar with it, go ahead and watch the video that we send you a link to. It will make it all clear. Someone also asked, can I do what I'm doing with the Sekonic 478DR? The answer is yes, you can. The 478DR can use the DTS software exactly the same way. If you want to do the spot part, you would need to purchase the 5-degree spot attachment for the 478. It does work fine. Is it as precise as the 1-degree spot meter in here? No, but it will get you pretty close. So yes, that is an option. Now, someone also asked, all right, I shot the targets on site, but I'm using the computer to process. So does that mean I have to take a laptop with me when I go out in the field? Well, I just did it all in one place just for the demonstration point of it. Typically what you'll do is you'll create your profile separately before you go out on your shoot. Go ahead and just go find some bright shade somewhere in your yard or around where you are. Go ahead and create the process, load it into your meter, and then go out on your shoot. So you're not going to typically do this on location. I just did it because it was a nice place to film. Let's see. So someone asked, what's the advantage of tweaking the custom profile? The reason I do that is because if you looked at the clipping points that it gives you, they are extremely conservative. We'll just say it that way. I like to maybe push the edges a little bit more. Since I'm using the 758 and I've got that 1-degree spot meter, I can be pretty precise and know what the brightest thing in this scene is. If you go with the numbers in the software, that's fine. It gives you a lot of wiggle room if you do it that way. I just sometimes like to maybe push the edges a little bit. But a lot of times, depending, if I've got variable light like I did during that day, there were clouds flying back and forth and the light did change. So in that case, I went with the conservative numbers. It's really a personal preference. You can just leave it alone, or you can tweak it a little more if you want to maybe play a little closer to the edge. And let's see. So someone asked, how do you transfer the profile from the DTS into the meters? It's very simple. I'm sorry I didn't actually film a video showing you that, but it's a matter of just plugging in a USB cable into the side of the meter. And when you plug it in, the software sees the meter, choose the profile you want, tell it if you want it in position 1, 2, or 3, click on the transfer button, and it's there. And I'm going to show you how you get to that in just a second. In fact, someone asked, does it matter if you shoot RAW versus JPEG for the calibration? Good question. Not really, actually it doesn't from my tests. In fact, I shoot RAW, bring them into Lightroom, and then export them as JPEGs. So because I always shoot RAW, I don't bother shooting JPEGs. But could you shoot JPEGs and doing? Yes. It's not going to be that much of a difference. All right, so let's take a little closer look. We've created the exposure profile. Now it takes a few buttons to make it active. As I mentioned earlier, you can create as many profiles as you like, but the meter can store up to 3 at a time. So let's go ahead. I'm going to walk over here so we can zoom in, and you'll be able to see better on what's going on here. So I don't know if you can see right up in the upper right-hand corner, right above my aperture reading, it says camera 1. It's kind of tiny, but hopefully you can see it. Now, if you want to change these, hold in the mid-tone button, which is right here. I'll get my big thumb out of the way. And then I'll press ISO 1. And as I hit it again, you can see it changes to camera 2 and then camera 3. So I can just toggle through. And 1 was the one that we just created for the Alpha 99 at the location. So that's how you do that. It's pretty simple, and again, you can store up to 3 of them. So now what's going on is this meter knows how my camera sees light. It knows the camera's dynamic range capabilities. It can even let me know if I'm going to have problems with highlight or shadow clipping. I can store multiple readings in here and see a whole scorecard of where things are falling based on what my camera can do. These are functions that we'll explore in future webinars. We're just going to keep it simple today and go over these basic settings. Now, there are a couple of other custom functions that I find very handy to change, including 1, how the meter displays the aperture, and 2, changing the function of the ISO 2 button so that I can use it for both filter and exposure compensations. So let's go back to the falls and see how and why you might want to do this. Now this kind of dappled light situation is really tough, so let's get the meter set up first. Now this meter is set up as it would be out of the box, and there's a couple things you're probably going to want to change, or at least for landscape photography, and these are the recommendations that I'd have. Now to do this, we're going to have to go into the custom function menu, so let's do that. By the way, when you get a 758, there is a little target or a little card there. I'll show you this closer, but this has a listing of what each of the custom functions do. And the 2 we're concerned about are custom function 1 and custom function 3. What custom function 1 does is it changes the function of the ISO 2 button, which is right here. Now, ISO 2 button is normally just what it says. It's going to give you the readings as if you were using a different ISO. This is actually a holdover from the days when photographers were shooting film and the ISO 2 was for their Polaroids. Well, I find it much more useful to change this over to a filter compensation, because 2 things I'm going to do. I'm going to use a circular polarizer, so that's going to cut down on the amount of light. And secondly, I'm going to use the spot meter to put that brightest highlight towards the very right of the frame, or the very right of the histogram, without having it clip. Because remember, landscape photography, clipping those highlights is deadly. So let's go into the custom function menu. It's really simply done. Let me get it in a little closer here. I just hold in the mode button and put on the power button. And you'll see in the upper right hand corner it says CS, and you can see 011. Well, 1 again is the compensation. We want to change that from the ISO to compensation, so we just tap the mode button once and you can see it changes to number 1. And the other one we want to change is 3. Now for 3, that is how many steps do you want to have on your meter? Do you want it to be in full tenths of a stop or thirds of a stop? I find thirds of a stop handy for most cameras and for most people to use, because that's what your camera is set in. It's set in thirds of a stop. So that is, thirds of a stop is number 1. So I hit the mode button, I go to 1, turn the power off, turn it back on, and now the ISO 2 button is set for filter compensation, and the meter is now going to read in thirds of a stop rather than tenths. So again, it makes it easier to match the meter to what your camera's doing. So having the meter show 1/3 stop increments, as you can see, it's really helpful, because now the meter is exactly mirroring the numbers that you see on your camera. Tenths of a stop I find very handy in the studio. And by the way, when you're creating the DTS shots, you should leave the meter in tenths of a stop for that, because you might have noticed in the software it asks you for tenths. After that's all done, I like to convert it over to thirds of a stop, because that's what my camera tells me, and it's easier for me to think, especially if it's an early morning sunrise and my brain hasn't completely kicked in, that I know that when I see 7/1, I can just put that in my camera, rather than if I had 5, 6, and 7/10, which would be the same thing, but a little bit confusing to a lot of folks. So just leave it at thirds of a stop when you're shooting, tenths of a stop when you're doing the DTS software. Also, having the ISO 2 button set as an exposure compensation will let the meter quickly calculate how to place those highlights close to the bright edge without causing any clipping, and now we'll be ready to shoot. We'll go into that a little bit more. I just want to show you a couple of questions. Someone asked, ISO 100 or ISO 400 for landscape? Since with most of my landscape photography, I'm going to use a tripod, I always want the lowest ISO. Yes, 400 ISO is very clean, but I print very large a lot of times. I have a handful of 48 and 60-inch prints. In fact, Jen, our producer here, how big was that print I printed out for you? 60 inches wide? I did a shot for her 60 inches wide. So I want the lowest ISO because even at 400, you start to get a little bit of noise in those deep shadows. So you're going to want to get the best file possible. You might have noticed I had the tripod I was using at the scene. My favorite tripod to travel with is a Benro Travel Angel 2. I love how it folds up into nothing and it's really light. So keep a tripod with you at all times, if possible, when you're shooting, because a lot of times you're going to need to bring your shutter speed down to capture the depth of field you want. Plus, in order to get the water flowing, obviously, I had to have my shutter speed much slower than I could have it in hand hold. Someone asked, is there any difference if you're going to be converting to black and white in the tonal range? And the answer is no. It's going to be exactly the same, so that's not an issue. Someone said they have the Lastolite Ezybox, both 12 and 18% gray. I'm not familiar with them, but I'm familiar with Lastolite. Will they do the job? And if yes, the 12 or 18%. Use the 18%. As I mentioned, the Sekonic target that is in the ColorChecker Passport is actually about a 20% gray. If you have an 18% gray card, again, it's maybe less than a tenth of a tenth or a little less than a tenth of a stop difference. It'll be fine. So use the 18% for that. A couple of you were asking questions about stuff that's kind of really a different subject, like can the 758 do percentage of flash compensation for, percentage of flash to ambient? Yes, it can show you that. Subject for another day. Now, someone asked, how do I find out what the filter compensation for a polarizer and UV haze? UV haze really doesn't really take any light away. Polarizer does, and we're going to talk about that actually almost now, so stay tuned. Now, in the scenes that we're in, where you've got bright highlights to protect, you can see from the software, if I wanted to be safe, I'll use that compensation factor of 2.5 stops based on the camera's exposure profile. If I wanted to push it, I could go to 3. We'll stay with 2.5 for now. Now, most top-end DSLRs can do this safely. Now, if you're shooting a more mid-range camera, or if you're using your camera's spot meter and it's 5 degree, maybe you have a little bit of a wide-angle lens on it, I might play it safe and just use 2 stops. So what we're going to do is look for the brightest part of the scene. In this case, the white of the waterfall and the bright clouds. What I can do is take a continuous reading until I see the highest number. And to do that, I just spin the dial to go to the spot meter, and then I'll hold in the measuring button. By the way, one other custom function that I didn't talk about in the custom function changes is custom function 17. And if you look on your little target or your little card, it says 17 is what do the buttons do? And it only tells you 0 and 1. It says standard and reverse. Well, if you actually look in the manual, there's 0, 1, and 2. And what 2 is called automatic. If I want to take an ambient measurement, the button on this side, if I just hold this out for ambient reading, is my ambient reading. The gray button on this other side is the memory button. However, I find that when I'm using the spot meter, it's easier because of the way I'm holding the meter to use my trigger finger and make this memory button be the measurement button for the spot meter. If you set 17 to custom function 17 to number 2, it automatically reverses those. It's called auto. So that's the setting I'd recommend for that. So what else? Now, so this is where that exposure compensation comes in, based on the DTS software. Again, 2.5 was the conservative one, 3 would be pushing it. All I need to do is press in the ISO 2 button and rotate the jog wheel counterclockwise until the display in the upper right reads 2.5. So when I press the ISO 2 button, then the display will show me the readings to open up that 2.5. So let's go ahead and take a look and go closer to the meter again. All right, so here's our meter, and I've got the ISO 2 button right here. Now, if you look in the upper right-hand corner there, when I push this in, You can see right now it says 0, 0. If I rotate counterclockwise till it says 2.5, that would be a 2.5 stop compensation. Now also, we've got shutter speed and aperture. So I've got shutter speed, which is T for time, aperture, think F for f-stop. If I hold in the mode button, I can go back to aperture, because generally when you're shooting landscapes, you're going to want to have your aperture stay constant. For example, if I take a reading right here in front of these lights, let me just go ahead and take our studio lights. You can see at f16, I would have to be an exposure of ½ a second. But if I'm taking a spot reading, it's going to be a little different. In fact, let's back off on that. Let's go ahead and do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the spot meter function, and I'm going to make believe that our studio lights, a big softbox off to my left, is a cloud. So I'm at 100 ISO. I've got my spot meter set. I look through, and I hit the gray measure button, and it says, well, I'm at 100 ISO. And let me show you this up close again. My shutter speed would be an 1/80th of a second at f16. However, that would put that brightest highlight right in the middle. It would actually make that bright white gray. I want to open this up 2.5 stops to push that white right over to the right of my histogram. So if I hold in the ISO 2 button, you can see we've got our 2.5 stop compensation. Notice it goes from f16 at 1/80th of a second to f16 at a 1/15th of a second. So not having to figure out in my head, I just hit the ISO 2 button and I see a 1/15th of a second. That's the number. What that does is that 1/15th of a second now takes that bright white and puts it back over to the right. Because remember, when your meter takes a reading, it's putting that in the middle. You're telling it, okay, this thing that I'm pointing at or this thing that I'm measuring, put it right in the middle of my exposure. Well, again, for my clouds or my bright water, that would make that middle gray. That's not what we want. We want it to be as bright as possible, and that's why the exposure compensation. Now, somebody asked earlier about, what if I put a polarizer on here? So that's going to continue to add to that. A polarizer is going to subtract more than that. Now, what you can do if you want to test your own is you can actually hold the polarizer up in front of your meter, take a reading, put it in front, spin it around, and see what change it has. I think what you'll find is most polarizers at full strength subtract 2 stops. Well, remember, we want to push that 2.5 stop limit to push our whites over to the right. If we add a polarizer, it's going to subtract another 2 stops. So what do you need to do? You need to add another 2 stops to that compensation. So instead of 2.5 stops, I'd need to open up 4.5 stops. And here's where the math starts getting a little complicated if you're trying to figure this out real quick in your head. Again, especially if it's a freezing sunrise and your brain's not functioning yet. So I'll hold the ISO 2 button and I'll go to 4.5. In fact, let me show you a zoom into this as well. So now if I hold an ISO 2, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, now it says 4.5. So I got a 60th of a second now, I remetered. My 60th of a second at 16 to open up 4.5 stops now goes to 3/10 or a third of a second. So I just went from a 60th of a second to a 1/3 of a second exposure, and that's 4.5 stops different. That's the advantage of having this all built into the meter, because it just quickly tells you that. And once you take that reading, you can spin the jog wheel to see other shutter speed and aperture combinations. Just select the combination that fits your needs, put those numbers in the camera, compose the shot, and know that you're just got the best exposure possible. Again, case in point, I'll show you up close one more time. So I've got 60th of a second at 16. Well, let's say, for example, I want it at f11 for some reason. I can just spin the dial until I see f11, and now it tells me, well, at f11, that would be 125th of a second. And if I add my 2.5 stops plus 2 stops for a polarizer, which is my ISO 2 button, I can see f11 would be 1/6 of a second. It sounds complicated and all. It sounds like a lot to keep track of, but it really isn't. Just look at the numbers that show up on here, put them into your camera, and you're done. If you're not using a polarizer, my compensation is just going to be that 2.5. Just put 2.5 there. If I wanted 11, I'm at 125th, hold in ISO 2, and it goes to 25th of a second. That's it. Put that in your camera, and you're not going to have to worry about missing the shot. Trust these numbers. Now, if you preview the image you take on your LCD, the whites are probably still going to seem blown out, and there may seem to be no detail in the shadows. If there's just a small amount of white in the scene, the histogram display on your camera might not even show it, and it's going to look like the histogram is way too far to the left and you've underexposed the frame. But you haven't. Your LCD is not that precise, and the histogram you're seeing is a histogram of a JPEG that's been processed from your file, not your raw data. Again, trust the numbers that the meter tells you. So now you get home, you download the images you've captured into your computer. Now I use Lightroom, but whatever software you use, you might be disappointed when you see that first raw capture. Histogram may look good, but the image just doesn't do justice to the scene the way you saw it. It certainly doesn't convey the feeling and the beauty of the scene that inspired you to take the shot in the first place. What the heck is going on here? Well, if you think back to when we first started today, I talked about the limitations of our cameras compared to our eyes. We need to adjust the contrast of both the highlights and the shadow areas so that the image starts to look how our eyes saw it. Now, in a bright sunny day with a well-lit scene, yeah, your exposure right out of the camera when you bring it into your software might look pretty good. But when you're dealing with a high contrast scene that you've exposed correctly, that's not going to be the case. Now, in addition to our software, by adjusting and redirecting the light and color, you can draw the viewer's eyes to the parts of the scene that you want to highlight. This is where the software comes in and the results can be dramatic. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but watch this software demonstration to see what I mean. I've talked before about how sometimes after you get what you consider that perfect digital exposure, it still doesn't look like your eyes saw the scene. That's because your camera just doesn't have the contrast that your eyes have. However, take a look at this scene. Now, this is actually a perfectly exposed scene, and we did this by using the spot meter. We metered on the brightest spot of the waterfall right here and opened up 2.5 stops using that reprogrammed ISO 2 button. And if we take a look at the histogram, we can see there's nothing clipping. In fact, it's not even coming over to the far right. And if we put the cursor over top of this, if you look underneath in the histogram in Lightroom, you can see that never does it get anywhere near 100, which would mean clipping. Now, when you look at this in the viewfinder, here's where using the histogram in the viewfinder becomes a challenge in this kind of photography because that looks blown out. But we look at it here and we see that it's not. What I wanted to show you is how fast and easy it is to then take this image, which is really an optimal digital capture of this scene, and put it back to the way that your eyes saw it. And watch this, it is really easy. I'm going to do it real quick and then I'll back up. So the highlights might be a little bit hot. I'd like to bring them down a little bit. The shadows are obviously too deep. And then I need to add a little bit more contrast and saturation to the scene. So let's do that. Just real quick, I'm going to do the express version first. Watch this. Highlights down halfway. Shadows, I'm going to bring them up all the way. Clarity, I'm going to add about 50 points. I like a lot of clarity in my landscape. Vibrance, which will deal with more subdued colors, particularly blues, I'll come up about 25. And then my saturation just up about 10. And voila, take a look at that. Look at the difference on that image versus what we started with. In fact, I have them prepared already. Let me undo this. I'm going to reset the image, and I'll show you the before and the after. There it is. There's after, there's before. And you saw how fast that was to do. And the really cool thing is if you're doing a whole series in the same spot, select the rest of the images in the series, click on Sync. I'll just choose Check All. Click on Synchronize, and bam, they're all done. And I can open up the other images and see that those effects will all be applied. Let's let this one catch up. You can see there. So we've got a little bit different angles, different flow of the water, but that's how easy it is. You just need to start with the best digital capture you can, and you don't want those highlights clipped at all. Okay, I know I did that really quickly, so I'll just go it through one more time. So again, our highlights, I would like to bring them down a little bit. They're not clipping, but I want to add a little more tooth to them. Obviously, the shadows need to come way up, and then we'll discuss clarity, vibrance, and saturation. And you can do this either in Lightroom, by the way, or in Adobe Camera Raw. They're same exact settings. So again, I want to bring the highlights down a little bit, and I'm going to start to bring it down, and I know probably 40 or 50 points, and you can see now the water's got a little bit more tooth there. Obviously the shadows are way deep, so I'm going to bring those up, and heck, I'm going to bring them all the way up. I'm going all the way up to plus 100. Now you can see we've opened up the detail in the shadows nicely. Blacks and whites, everything looks fine there. Let's go down to presence. Clarity adds structure and contrast to fine detail. So I'm going to add about halfway up. That's maybe a little bit too much. It starts to get a little bit grungy, kind of like a little faux HDR. If you go up too high, if I went up to 100, you can see it's a little overly done. But I find 50 plus used a lot when I'm doing landscapes. Vibrance will increase the saturation of less vibrant colors, primarily the cool colors. You'll see the biggest effect on blue and some greens. So I'm going to bring that up about 25 points. And you'll see over in here is where it's going to change. Let me back. I can double click on vibrance to reset it. And just watch over on the far end of the falls. And you can see it gets a little more color in it. And then lastly, saturation. Doesn't need too much, just a little bit. I'm going to bring it up just about plus 10. And there we go. That's how easy and fast it is. And take a look at that exposure. Trust in the meter. What I did again, I just metered the spot meter off the brightest spot on the waterfall, opened up 2.5 stops from there, and trusted it. Because what I saw through the viewfinder still made it look like that waterfall was clipped and overexposed. But trust in the meter and you will get perfect results and a perfectly editable digital file. I hope you thought that was as cool as I did. Even though I really kind of knew what was coming, I was still really excited by the transformations I saw with these simple edits. Now, in some cases, I will continue to fine-tune the color. I'll adjust the light patterns a little bit. But these 20 to 30-second edits really got me pretty close. By the way, if you're not a Lightroom person, if you're a Photoshop person, everything I did there is exactly the same in Adobe Camera Raw. There's no difference there. A couple more questions before we continue on. And thank you for this question, because the tendency when I'm using this gear is you get a little too close to it and you forget some of the basics. Someone asked, said, well, the 758 might have a 1-degree spot meter, but how do you aim it? Well, good question if you've never used one. Well, if you look here, we've got these things on either end. There's an eyepiece on this side, and this is the end where it's gathering the light. It's actually like a spotting scope. When I go here, I actually see inside. There's no way for me to show this, unfortunately. You actually see what you're looking at right through here. So as I scan around the scene, I can see the cloud edges and the water. Good question. It's not obvious, but yes, as I look through here, it's all like a 1-degree spotting scope, and I actually see through the eyepiece what I'm pointing at. And again, so I answered this, but just to reiterate, someone asked, why not just shoot and read the histogram? Because the histogram isn't completely accurate, and it's going to miss if you have just a really little tiny bit of bright white in the histogram. Again, remember, the stuff you're seeing on the back of your camera is a JPEG. The camera is processing the JPEG with the settings that are in the camera and then displaying that data on the LCD. So the histogram you're seeing is of that processed JPEG, not of the raw file. Also, I don't have to take a shot and then look at it and decide, okay, the histogram's a little to the left or right, adjust my exposure, take another shot and do it again. That kind of chimping stuff, remember going back to landscape photography being kind of like big game hunting, I don't want to have to take a shot, fumble with it, and take another shot because I might miss something. That light can be very fleeting. And if you're shooting an animal, you've got a bird in flight, you only get one shot. So by using the meter, it tells me ahead of time exactly what's going on. I can pick that brightest spot, put those numbers in the camera, and forget it. Then you can just shoot and you can know that it's going to be great. Someone asked about, is metering through the polarizer accurate to 1/10 of a stop like the rest of the meter? Absolutely. And you can rotate it around. Just hold it in your hand and rotate it, and as long as you're pushing in the meter button, it will constantly meter, and you'll see the changes. But I've found that my polarizer that I use at full power is 2 stops. Same thing if you're using Ratten filters, if you're using color filters. Not something I typically do anymore on my digital cameras. I do that in software, but if you're using a Ratten filter, yes, it's going to read it exactly the same way. Another question, someone asked about Canon's ISO 50 setting. I have in the past mentioned that from what I've read, the best ISO settings on the Canons were 160, 320, etc., multiplications of that. I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. My understanding is that the ISO 50 setting is really designed to match some studio gear. It doesn't, from what I understand, it doesn't give you actually any better performance of the sensor than it does at 100 or 160. I think it's more just to match film and previous settings. So that's my understanding. You might want to Google that. Someone asked, they don't have a light meter. They've been looking at the Sekonic 358. Does that meter have any of the functionality I've mentioned? The Sekonic 358 is a great ambient meter. It will also give you a percentage of flash to daylight if that's what you're doing, but it does not have a spot meter. There is an attachment for it, but the 358, unfortunately, to say, actually has been discontinued. It's kind of been replaced by the 478, which does have these features. Let's see, what else? Do I need to select my camera profile in Adobe Camera Raw before doing my edits on an image? No, because the exposure profile is just in the meter to give me the best exposure. When I'm in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom, I will choose the color profile, which is what I create with the Passport. Again, subject for another day, we'll send you the link to that. Let's continue on. I can see I'm just about out of time, and I got a couple more things to cover. So let's back up. Why did these edits work so well? I trusted what the meter was telling me. If you put these tools to work in your photo kit, you're going to get the same results. The precision of the built-in 1 degree spot meter and these calculating abilities really make the 758 really the Rolls Royce and the ideal companion for any serious landscape photographer. I do teach landscape photography workshops around the country, and I frequently have people join me on these classes that have these. Many of them have never taken them out of the box and they have no idea how to use them. So I frequently end up doing kind of an impromptu class on how to use this, and they've all gotten better results once they learned how to use it. Now this, as I mentioned, this meter can do a lot more than we talked about today. We'll explore more capabilities in the future. I just wanted to have this couple of tips and settings that will help your landscape photography. So let's sum up. First of all, a combination of the ColorChecker Passport and the DTS software let us create that exposure profile for the camera. So now the meter knows exactly how the camera measures light and its complete tonal range. Now this is not a small advantage because different cameras, and if you do shoot with multiple cameras, can be very different in what they think the perfect exposure is. My wife shoots Canon, I shoot Sony, and my Sony Alpha 99 and her 7D in the same exact scene are between 1/2 and 3/4 of a stop different. So by creating a profile, the meter knows exactly how your specific camera thinks that middle gray should be rendered. I can also use this to have it tell me the complete clipping range, highlight, and shadow if I'm doing HDR. Again, another subject for another day. We saw from the software that I actually could have set my safety margin. If you remember back to the curve in the DTS software, I could have set my safety margin up to 3 or 3.5 stops even. I chose to stay at 2.5 stops to give myself a lot of wiggle room, again, since the lighting conditions were very variable with the passing clouds. This still put the brightest part of the image very close to the right side of the histogram without any danger of clipping those highlights. We also saw that having the best capture possible made for an easy adjustment of the tones in the image and really resulted in a great exposure. If you trust in what the meter is telling you, you'll know that you're going to have the best capture possible. That allows you to stop worrying about exposure, stop chimping at the camera, stop looking at the histogram and trying to make adjustments, and concentrate on the most important aspect of what you're doing. I always ask people this. Ask yourself the question. I do it to myself. Why are you taking the shot? I find that asking that question helps me to create a better image. We all have the tendency to want to include too much information and too many details on our photographs. By asking that question, I find it makes me focus, and it frequently forces me to simplify the scene. When I've got that completed image that draws me in, and I can kind of remember the breeze and hear the sounds and the smells while I linger and explore, then I know I've got a good image. All that said, I do shoot for others, but I shoot primarily for myself. I capture the scenes that speak to me, and I know that a like-minded audience will appreciate those photographs. Even if they don't, I still return to that original statement, shoot for yourself. Until then, if you'd like to learn more about landscape image editing, or maybe join me on a landscape photography workshop, we'll give you a link. You can find out everything that's coming up with me. What else do we have to cover? What's coming up next? Oh, our next presentation, next Thursday, will be our first shoot using off-camera flash and mirrorless cameras. We're going to use Pocket Wizards and a Sekonic meter to improve that. So if you've started getting into those cameras, stay tuned. That'll be a lot of fun. So let's finish up. I'd like to thank Sekonic for sponsoring us. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and thank you for the great questions. There'll also be a special offer for the Passport. If you purchase a 758, you'll get the Sekonic ColorChecker for free, or if you want one of these, there'll be an offer where you can get it directly. So until next time, again, thank you. I look forward to seeing you all online again soon. Keep learning, keep shooting, and most of all, enjoy yourself while doing it. This is photography. It should be fun. Have fun with your images and share them with everyone. Thanks again, everybody. See you soon. Be well.